Catus Maximus here. This is a video about the ever-changing Duralast ratchets over the last 5, 7, 8 years or so. Seems about that time AutoZone really wanted to step up their hand tools, somewhere around 2010, a little afterwards, and they came out with a bunch of really quite nice ratchets, quick release as well as fixed handle, and then these flex heads. They were these 36 tooth. I call them a Williams. I don't know if they're made by Williams, but they have a very similar ratchet mechanism. They were just a really nice professional ratchet with the, replace worn parts, the really nice stamped plate, nice tight anvils on them, screws that go through the body. So when you get a rebuild kit, although I've heard that you can't get rebuild kits, at least from AutoZone, but you can find some other manufacturers, such as I believe the OEM tools, which have more of a brush finish or a satin finish, are the similar types of ratchets. But the point is that I bought this, and then a few years later they've replaced these with the 72 tooth ones, which just didn't have the same build quality. They just weren't quite as nice. I did a review of the Harbor Freight straight handle icons versus the flex head icons, and it's the same deal there. The flex head ones just aren't as nice as the straight handles. And that was the deal here, that when they went to the 72 tooth mechanism, it still is a similar ratchet mechanism, and I'll show in a minute here, but it just wasn't quite as nice. The screws thread into the body, their T7s here or their T8s here. Not as many seals, where this one actually has a rubber seal under the anvil as well as under the switch. And now they've even eliminated these, and they've gone to the gear wrench. These are made by Gear Wrench. They have the very same design language and dual walking pawls as the Gear Wrench, but they're only 100 tooth. And so a few years ago you may have bought this and you'll end up with 100 tooth. So these are indexing, and I do like indexing ratchets, but they are not always useful in all situations, especially if you need an angle that's in between the indexing point, or you're in a situation where you're ratcheting and you actually kind of have to articulate the ratchet dynamically as you're using it. In those situations, indexing can be kind of frustrating. So they're helpful in some situations to hold the head, but you always want to have just a non-indexing flex head. And so that could be a little bit annoying because you're used to these. Now when you go in there, all you have is the choice of this indexing ratchet. Also, interestingly enough, on the old ones, it was guaranteed for life. Even on these second generations ones, although in much smaller print, guaranteed for life. They don't even bother to stamp that on the guaranteed for life at all, which I thought was just a little bit amusing. These are fine tooth. They do have an easy to use reverse lever. Maybe a little too easy. It might be a little easy to bump. But really, a lot of the difference here is like this anvil just is stamped. We can see that it isn't been machined. It's been raw forged. There's quite a bit of anvil play here. It really wobbles back and forth and actually goes in and out a bit. That's in stark contrast to the 36 tooth, which really had a pretty darn tight anvil in it. A lot of people do have faith in the gear wrench mechanism, but I do wonder if this ratchet here would really either last as many cycles or just take as much torque. I'm sure both of these, the anvils probably would break, but I like to see after a few years in a shop of heavy use whether this really does hold up over this one, especially if it wants to start slipping, because it just doesn't seem as nice. There just isn't as much material in there. The head is a little bit wider. This used to be a really nice, elegant pear head shape. We can see where it actually tapers down pretty nicely. It's a little bit difficult in the camera angle. We can also see that the head is significantly shorter. The pivot point is actually much higher up or much closer to the anvil, allowing you to get in a little bit tighter spaces. Although all that extra length does get just a little bit longer of a handle, it still isn't as long as these super long gear wrench ones. And I think that's a little bit interesting. I mean, it really is like a gear wrench. We can just see the shaping and everything seems basically the same. It just seems to have a cheaper anvil, where on a genuine gear wrench it is a machined anvil. And they do a little bit nicer finish work and some beveling on the gear wrench ones. They are kind of expensive. And it's just a little annoying to buy a ratchet that's like this, and then, if you need to replace it, to go in and you are forced to basically take something that's like this. Understand products change, but it seems with AutoZone, it's just a little ridiculous when they have a different set of ratchets on the shelf every 2 or 3 years. And it really seems that they're dazzling you with higher tooth counts, and it does have low backlash or backlash resistance. I should say back drag or back swing resistance. But I really don't believe that this is a ratchet that's going to be, those kind of ratchets that you end up finding 50 years later, like I do with many high quality vintage ratchets, and have it just be working really nice. I just don't get the same feeling versus something like this. So I'm sure if you found one that was half a century old, it would still work just like it did from day one. Let's take a look at the mechanisms. I've done another whole video on the icon. I'm not going to do that, but I would say that for basically the same price, I would certainly go over the flex head icon just because it's a little bit longer than the Duralast. And even though this mechanism isn't as good as the straight handle icons, the cheap icon, surprisingly enough, I believe is better than the 100 tooth AutoZone, cheapo gear wrench. There's really no doubt about it, and it has even less back drag swing than this one does. Anyway, all right, here we are. I'll quickly show these up front, but there's a striking, just totally different types of ratchets. Here's the Williams, the 36 tooth, and it really is nice. There's a seal under the switch. The switches and the pawl are screwed together, and then of course the cover plate covers that screw so it can never come loose or anything. Really just a nice design. It is a similar design, but this one's just much worse on the 72 tooth one, where it's just a cast zinc switch and it just sits into a little groove in the back of this, and so it's a bare if you pull out the anvil, because this thing kind of floats out of there and then it's hard to align it, and just isn't quite as nice. But then we have the walking pawl, and it really, I'll show you why having tight anvils is a big deal, and the reason I really criticize these new 100 tooths and gear wrenches for their wobbly anvils, because they use a split dual pawl design. When you have a really nice anvil, such as in this one where it's all really tight, then when you're ratcheting, even if you're in an awkward situation, you're pulling or pushing on it, and make sure that that anvil's nice and square with the teeth. Half of ratchets that do slip wouldn't slip if they had really nice precision and then pretty strong springs to really drive those pawls into their tight. People didn't like the switches on these because these are pretty hard to flip just with your thumb. You really need to use a fingernail, but they do engage quite reliably. These will engage pretty reliably as well, but these 72 tooth ones, if you put a little bit too heavy of a grease in there, it will slip a little bit until it works out. Sometimes it slips, sometimes it doesn't. But on the fine tooth ratchets, that can be a big deal, is where you just have too much teeth or too much grease, and they just kind of push the teeth out. But just the way this one's designed, it's okay because there's still lots of engagement, but not quite as nice. And now with the walking pawl design, if we pull this out and don't lose the pawls, we can see in there that there's actually two separate ratchet pawls. They're two separate little units in there. And so when you have an anvil that's rocking back and forth, you only have a pawl. They do both engage if you put a lot of torque on it. That's what I've read online. But under more normal situations, when this is rocking up, it's just engaging just on the very corner of this, or just on one little edge. And you can almost see that because there's more wear on the inside here where it's shinier than there is on the outside edge, just because the way it's rocking back and forth and isn't maintaining as precise an alignment. And just like any other, like gears, if you have something where you have a pressure point on one side, it's going to wear that at a very accelerated rate. And then as it wears, there's less overall material remaining, and then that remaining material will also wear down more quickly than if it was all evenly aligned to start off with. And then it's kind of exacerbated if I compare the widths of the 36 tooth versus the 100 tooth. We can see how coarse that 36 tooth is, but we can see right here that there's actually quite a bit more width on the 36 tooth. And then the other reason coarse teeth do last longer is we can see that they have deeper roots. There's more cross-sectional area on each tooth to wear. You're getting more meat into the mass of the material versus just a really fine, essentially texturing on the outside. We know that in those situations, you want thicker gear teeth. If you take apart a big electric drill that has multiple gears that are being reduced, as the torque goes up, as in each gear stage, the thickness of the gear teeth themselves get larger. And it's really been proven for years and years. Things like Milwaukee Sawzalls is a great example. You get some older Sawzalls and you'll find some little motor spindles that have 6, 7, 8 teeth on them, but they just end up wearing, there just wasn't enough cross-sectional area. You take apart any Sawzall that's been made in the last 5 to 10 years, probably 10 years, they all have 4-tooth motors. And they look odd. You're like, wow, that's a really coarse 4-tooth motor. That cross-sectional area really makes a difference and is what they have standardized on. So it's another real-world example of why the whole battle for finer teeth really is kind of a red herring. Sorry for the long video about ratchets, but I kind of wanted to get into that and kind of gripe a little bit about the whole fine tooth ratchets. It's nice to have a couple of them in some certain situations, and I've certainly run into them, such as doing, oddly enough, power steering belts on our 90s Nissan V6s, especially like Pathfinders. Those things can be, it's like unbelievable trying to get at that tension bolt. And you can only move a ratchet, just a few degrees, but in just about every other situation, I mean, it's been by far the exception that a difference would have been made with a high tooth count over 36 teeth or, quite frankly, even 20 teeth. And I've certainly encountered a lot of used and beat up fine tooth ratchets that slip versus coarse tooth ratchets. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. Until next time, Catus Maximus out.